All right, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for making this last session. I don't know whether Matthew might have mentioned it in church or something. I was rushed into hospital with the blue lights flashing and everything into the emergency room last night with a suspected heart attack. And so I've just spent the last 14 hours first of all, in what the Americans call the emergency room, and then I was admitted to the acute medical ward while they were trying to work out whether I was having a heart attack. So just to say, I haven't had any sleep for the last 36 hours, and
What are you doing here?
teaching you. Uh, um, well, it's the final session, and I firmly believe in honouring my commitments, but I'm not going to be my normal, bouncy self. Though my experience of teaching my course on St John in Exeter, as David and Faye know very well, was also taught through some significant illness, including having to teach one class from South Africa when I was too ill to get home. And normally I found that the class was the best medicine to help me perk myself up. The good news is that I didn't have a heart attack, but I do have a severe heart condition, and it was mimicking all the signs. I haven't really recovered from the jet lag of getting here as it was. Anyway, so I would ask your understanding for the next hour and crave your thoughts and prayers for the next week or so, because I mean, as soon as this is finished, I'm going back to bed and trying to get myself together again. I heard a little bit about what was being said online between Dennis and Faye and David. I have no idea how many you have in the room, TJ, but would anybody in the room like to wave a hand and respond to, say, the first couple of questions about how you found it and what you've appreciated or not?
We have a hand.
I really appreciate the really systematic way that you went about analyzing things. You stuck to the structure and you gathered the information. And I appreciated that you repeated that at the beginning of each class so that my thinking could be refreshed. I also wish we had had a little bit more time with the final few slides each time when we were summing up the findings. I know sometimes at the end we got really pressed, so I'm grateful to have those slides to go back and look at. So thank you for providing those.
Thank you. So I can just about make you out in the small little box in the corner of my screen. I don't know your name. Hello, who are you?
Hi, I'm Amanda McDonald.
Sorry, say again.
Amanda McDonald.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciated your comment about the method, or the doing it the same way. I've been teaching this material for 20 years. I've been trying to write the book for 20 years. The Imitating Jesus, which I had a couple of copies of available right at the start of the courses, was the first half of what was meant to be a single book on the New Testament ethics, where the first half was going to be the ethics in the New Testament, and the second half was going to be the New Testament in ethics. After it was 7 or 8 years overdue and already twice the length of the total book, they asked if they could publish the first half separately. So that's why it was called Imitating Jesus, and that was looking at the ethics in the of ethics of Jesus, ethics of each of the gospel writers, ethics of Paul, and so on. And the apartheid chapter, what is now at the end of that book, was meant to be the halfway point. And then the second book was going to be called Following Jesus, with the subtitle of Money, Sex, Power, Violence. And it was Matthew who was the person who said, Richard, you'll sell a lot more books if you don't call it Following Jesus, but call it Money, Sex, Power, Violence, and the Meaning of Life, and have Following Jesus as the subtitle. And then the subtitle turned into what we have in this course, i.e., can we actually follow Jesus? But my experience is that your comment is an interesting one about the importance of repeating the method, in that the first time I did this in South Africa, I started with a chapter on a session on apartheid, thinking they would all understand that, and they had a real difficulty getting through the method. So the next time I did it, I changed it round, and they still had the difficulty. And then I've realised over the years that it is that people are not sure the first time I take them through the 4 steps, or the half a dozen steps. It's all new, and it doesn't really matter what the topic is. The first time through, it's hard work. And then, Amanda, as you rightly say, once you've done it a couple of times, it doesn't really matter what the sequence of the topics are. By the time you get to the end of the course, I hope and pray that actually that sequence has become clearer. So I hope that's been the experience of people in the room, and the difficulty of the first time through hasn't put too many people off or made them walk away with their feet. In terms of the second part, yes, you're absolutely right. I had far too much material. This is really designed as a residential conference, as with a day on each topic rather than an hour on each topic. On the other hand, the final section, which is where we try to apply it to those critical questions, is not for me to do on my own. My whole point of my method is that is for the group to do. And what we ideally ought to have needed to do was to have an hour after each of my input, where you then as a group discuss the material. And in particular, I have praised several times TJ's Braver Angels, I think it was what it was called, group, as a ways of trying to bridge, particularly being able to listen to the views of those you don't necessarily agree with, because that was absolutely pivotal for the whole South Africa experience was pivotal for me. Working with Desmond Tutu in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and watching people being forced to listen to each other, whether they were black, white, coloured, or whatever, whether they were a freedom fighter or a terrorist, depending on what you called them, and whether they were security forces or oppressive fascists, but everybody having to be in the same room and listening to one another, and realising that they had all suffered, was hugely life-changing, which is why I, at the end of every section, I have left you with the dilemma, in the sense that my contribution to the discussion is to provide you with the biblical material. How you then apply that, the one thing I'm absolutely clear about is you can't just simply read off from the New Testament and say, oh, the answer for this topic today is X. It doesn't work like that. But on the other hand, nor am I prepared to give up on the New Testament to say it doesn't have anything to say. So I'm providing you with the text, and then it's over to you to talk to one another about how you provide it. So thank you, Amanda. Anybody else want to say anything from the floor?
Good morning. My name is Bill Purley, and I just want to thank you, because I thought your topics were on a level that I could relate to. There's a little bit of stretching, but I could relate to it, so I got a lot out of it. What did I find difficult? You talk very fast. Well, maybe that's part of what you said before, that you're trying to cram an awful lot into the hour.
And I speak with a funny accent, Bill.
Richard, this is Gary, the bookseller.
Hi, Gary.
Sorry you're not feeling well. Thank you so much for conducting this course over, 5-6 weeks. It really reminded me that all of the books of the Bible have a lot of juicy content in them, and a lot of wonderful content to go back to, and you've given me the impetus, or the push to really dive into the books of the Bible, and really get to some answers that you've posed, questions that you posed. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate that very much, and thank you for your help, and thank you also for your friendship and interest and encouragement when I was in Winnetka. What about the second part of that slide? We've had a comment about what Amanda appreciated. We've had Bill found my speed difficult. We've had a nice note from Gary. Thank you. What about was there anything you'd like to ask me, or what you want to do next?
Personally, I would like to have a book group with one of your books that follows up on this, so we could do it in a little more depth and spend a little more time discussing it.
Finish the book, Richard.
Well, I owe Matthew a huge debt for helping me with it in the earlier stages, and I still have a lovely picture which I was very tempted to put up on the screen on one occasion of Matthew on his birthday in about 2015, where I printed out the half of the book that was then written, and he was working his way through it, and we spent all afternoon in a brewery discussing his birthday and discussing the book. So I think I had some good thoughts that afternoon, but it was difficult to remember them afterwards. So I am grateful for this opportunity to put the whole thing together, and it has made me realise actually that the book is important, and I do actually want to finish it. So I'm grateful for that. In terms of the comment that I'm sorry, I'm not sure I got the questioner's name just now. She was saying wanting to do it with a study group with one of my books. Well, I can array. My publishers are just the other side of Lake Michigan, and they can quite happily ship books across. Not across the lake. I think they bring it around the side. So anytime any of you want to have a little group and study one of my books, let me know, and I'll arrange for some books to be shipped over to Christchurch to Matthew or whatever at a discounted rate, so that you can study it. Because you're absolutely right. You need to be in a group to talk about it. But that will remind me to be able to say, and it's the slide at the end, that there are 3 or 4 books left on the bookstore, which certainly there is no point in them being posted back to me. So I've suggested to Gary that he cuts the prices down to just basically trying to cover some costs, and it would be really helpful if poor old Gary wasn't left with any books left at the end of today. So please feel that you should try and take one away. Anything from anybody else in the room, and then I'm going to just ask those online if they want to make any comments, because there were some things being said on the online group. But anything from anybody else in the room at this point?
Richard, this is Bob Spencer. I'm wondering if after your experiences overnight, you're tempted to revisit the discussion on life.
Well, I was quite glad that nobody was trying to turn the machines that were keeping me alive off. It made me realize also I think I said about the life thing, how I felt that the church had very much followed Jesus's not just his teaching but his real example of his anger at illness and death. And I've spent a lot of time in hospitals, both either for myself or my father had 16 heart attacks and died in the hospital where I was myself. So being in the same emergency room as the last time I'd been in that actually room was when I was sitting by his bedside as he was dying. So that was quite a sobering experience overnight, as you can imagine. But it also made me realise just that those places are full of angels, and the extraordinary dedication and commitment of the people, and particularly in this country, that are very poorly paid, is amazing. And it reinforces my basic point, which I shall come to in a minute, that this, I think, it is not coincidental that we call nurses sisters, and that the traditional nursing uniform looked like a nun's habit, because they were, the original hospitals were monasteries and the sisters were the sisters, the nuns. I think it's one of the the church has done an awful lot of damage, and I talked in my sessions about war and money, about how the church has blessed militarism and financialism, wrongly in my view. But in life, it was something where I think the church really has followed Jesus, which is why I find that the fact that today we've got being Christian and being biblical seems to be boiled down to opposing a couple of relatively minor issues like abortion or assisted dying, and missing out on the whole life-giving, caring bit, which is at the heart of what I think Jesus' thing was all about. I mean, for me, what was stunning when I did that research for that chapter was that, I set out thinking, well, there is no material for this. Abortion is not mentioned in the New Testament. Obviously, assisted dying is not mentioned in the New Testament. There's very, very little material, only to discover that once I stopped asking the 21st century question about what do we do about topic X, and asked, what does the New Testament say about the value and meaning of life? And that's why I called it Sex, Money, Power, and Violence and the Meaning of Life, or the Value of Life. I suddenly discovered 200 verses, and I suddenly realized that actually this was something that Jesus talked about more than ever, and in particular, John's Gospel talks a lot about, to pick up the previous point about the Johannine material. So, yeah, thank you on that. I think we'll just see whether Faye, Dennis, or David want to unmute themselves and say anything, the rest of the things that we were just discussing, or additional. And I'm hoping, TJ, that their sound will be able to be heard in the room. I suspect Dennis has got something to say. He usually has.
I'll try to be good. Just to add to what you've said, that how important it is to contextualize any time we consult the scripture in our whole charge and for compassion and life and living and care, prayer and spirit. All these things are there to lift us out of any kind of puzzlement of trying to mine, what we should do and shouldn't do from some kind of extraction from scripture. And we can get ourselves in all kind of quagmire trying to puzzle over what would Jesus do when we really are. The whole point of Jesus, I think, and a lot of what you've been saying, Richard, is we have to immerse ourselves in the life that's pointed to in scripture. And then the life of faith means, you're not going to be able to read out an answer from the scripture now, because you have to do the job that you're looking for scripture to do.
Thank you, Dennis. Right, well, look, we have a couple of comments there about me talking too fast and having too much material. I have half the number of slides that I normally do. And picking up Amanda's point, most of them you've seen before. So there is an amount of repetition, because I was trained as a teacher. I am a born teacher, and I know that you learn things by repeating them. And for those of you who are gifted with the photographic memory, you remember everything I've said all the way through. My thoughts and prayers are with you if you've been blessed or cursed with that. But for most people, repeating it is helpful. And so I'm going to try and crack through that and have some time at the end where we can pick up particularly the last couple of questions about what you want to do next, and feedback or final comments. And I want to say at this point, I'm grateful for the comments about how much people value me circulating the slides freely to those who are members of the course, though not for public posting or publication. And because as Faye and David, who are on our online group, who are coming in from Exeter, where I live, I have been doing that with my courses for them on John's Gospel and Mark's Gospel. Because, surprise, surprise, I know you'll find this hard to believe, but the overall feeling with most of my sessions there was I had too many slides and I talked too much. And we went too fast. So the whole point of giving the slides is a chance to look at them afterwards. And on the final slide, there is my email address and also the reference to my website. And you can see other videos where I've been teaching this kind of material on the website. And when I finish this, I should be putting a blog post up with the links to the 6 YouTube recordings that TJ has been doing, which I assume will be staying up on YouTube at least for a while, so people can follow up there. Do have a look through, and I very much, as I think David and Faye would bear witness, I very much appreciate getting individual emails from people who've been in the course with questions and comments. So if there isn't time to discuss everything today, please do send me an email and so on. So the question is, throughout, is that I've been trying to argue, and we'll come back to this key point, that Jesus is not primarily a teacher of ethics. And yesterday afternoon, when I was preparing this, when I was feeling not 100%, but before things got bad enough for me to start phoning 999 as we do here, or 911 as you would ring in the States, I Googled how many commands. Well, first of all, I went to my online Bible program, which allows me to analyze all the Greek text and so on, and asked how many imperatives there are in the Greek text of the New Testament, which was those of you who aren't familiar with grammatical language, an imperative is basically a command: do this, thou shalt not, or let us do this. That's a first person imperative. How many imperatives are there in the Greek text? Because my Greek program will allow me to search for how many future tenses there are, or how many nominative cases there are, or how many imperatives there are. And then I also Googled how many commands in the New Testament, and discovered some quite interesting facts. First of all, as I'm sure you know, there are just slightly short of 8,000 verses in the New Testament, of which 1,212 contain an imperative. So 15% of the verses in the New Testament contain a command. So that is, don't worry about 10 commandments. And I don't know if you know that there in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, what we call the Pentateuch, there are 365 thou shalt nots, one for every day of the year. And there are 257 thou shalts. So there's 612 commands in the first 5 books of the Bible, because that's where the story goes of the Gentile who went to Rabbi Shammai, the leader of the conservative faction, said, "You Jews have too many commands. Can you sum up the whole of the law in one command for me, please?" And Shammai, being a conservative sort, thought he was being rude and gave him a clip round the ear and sent him packing. He asked, "Could you sum up the law while standing on one leg?" Anyway, so the Gentile then went off to ask Rabbi Hillel, the leader of the liberal faction. And Rabbi Hillel stood on one leg and said, "Do not do to your neighbor what you don't want your neighbor to do to you." That is the sum of the law. Put his foot down on the ground and said, "The rest of it is Haggadah, commentary. It's very important. Now go and learn it." And when I worked with Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the leader of the Jewish community in the chief rabbi of Britain and the Commonwealth, he and I both had knee replacements while we were working together, and we discovered that we were being asked by our physiotherapist to stand on one leg for as long as we could, and we could barely manage to say, "Don't do to your neighbour what you don't want your neighbour to do to you," before we would fall over. So if there are 600 commands in the first 5 books of the Bible, there are 1,200 of them in the New Testament. I discovered this thing called the Christian Assemblies International in Australia, which says that they claim there are 1,050 commands in the New Testament for Christians to obey. Due to the repetition, we can classify them under 800 headings. They cover every phase of man's life in his relationship to God and his fellow men. We'll leave aside the sexist language, now and hereafter. But I love this bit. If obeyed, they will bring rich rewards here and forever. If disobeyed, they will bring condemnation and eternal punishment. And I can't understand how you can spend so long with the New Testament, you can count up 1,050 commands and miss the entire point of the New Testament. That reward, salvation or punishment, heaven and hell, reward, but are not, if you listen to anything that Jesus has to say about keeping commands and or being rewarded or being punished. It is called grace, and it's God's free gift. So I find it absolutely extraordinary that they can, not only that they can give us the 1,050 commands. I did toy with the idea of trying to put up the PDF that lists them all, because they've also done it in all sorts of interesting ways. You know, the 80 let uses and 15 let us nots, and there are 3 things to follow and 4 things to avoid, and all of that. But if you just Google 1050 commands in the New Testament, you will find the document. I also found another group called the New Start Discipleship who had a much more sensible list of 48 commands of Jesus that they pulled out of the Gospels. In a book called The Greatest Life Ever Lived, which published in 1999, they isolated 320 commands of Jesus. So there you go. There's plenty of commands if you want to follow any of those up. But the whole point about all of those is, of course, they are essentially word-based. They are committing my genre mistake of mistaking the restaurant, the book, for a restaurant, if I can put it that way. You remember when I talked about the restaurant at the end of the universe, and it's a book, not a restaurant. They are treating the New Testament as though it was an ethical instruction manual, and identifying all the commands, and that misses the whole point. And that is why I've had this slide every week, and partly because Matthew said I had to have it, because he's a huge fan of Monty Python, as you will probably know. But it was so fascinating in that conversation with John Cleese and Terry Jones, and it was the hottest ticket in the world of biblical scholarship. People wrote to me from all over the world and wanting to be invited to come and give a paper at a conference with the Pythons. But it was fascinating that they set out to try to take the Mickey. I'm using that rather than a stronger word. I hope it translates into American. Trying to take the Mickey out of Jesus, and realised that they simply couldn't do it, because they said once they actually read the Gospels, they realised what an extraordinary person he was. And they also say, well, why doesn't the church do what he does and says, and so on, which I think was a very good point. Which is why they invented the character of Brian as somebody that they could make fun of, who, and more importantly, they weren't so much making fun of Brian, they were making fun of the people who chose to follow Brian and do exactly what Brian was telling them not to do, because it was their view of the church. But my comment is that their view, I mean, I was great that they came to the view that they thought Jesus was a great moral teacher and not somebody to be made fun of, but they still missed the point that that's not actually the main point about Jesus, nor is the Bible a book of ethical teaching. And that's why I keep banging on about my life's work, which is to point out that that teaching that we had in this slide here is set within a narrative of a life. It is set within the narrative of a biography. What are the Gospels? As a great fan of British comedy, I follow Peter Cook, who talked about the art of the bleeding obvious. And the bleeding obvious is that the Gospels are not ethical instruction manuals. They are biographies. They are stories of a life, and they must be interpreted in that way. And therefore, to try to treat the Gospels as though they're ethical instruction manuals is to try to treat the book, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, as though it was a restaurant and try to order takeaway from it. You can't get takeaway out of The Restaurant from the Universe, and I don't think you can get takeaway out of the Gospels in quite that kind of way. It's this portrait of both deeds and words. So it's not enough to be able to say there is 1,000 commands or however many commands, words of Jesus, without looking at his deeds. And that was why I got given the prize by the Catholic Church, because the previous Pope Benedict said that the biblical scholarship for him had basically meant he lost contact with Jesus. And it was decided that my work brought Jesus back to the church, which was very nice of them. And you can see there I am giving Pope Francis a copy of Four Gospels, One Jesus, and I understand there is one remaining copy of that on the bookstore. So please, you can queue up and bid against each other for it. And therefore, this is the first half of the project, Imitating Jesus, where, as I say, this second half is following Jesus, is trying to take genre seriously and say that it is not a book of ethics, and taking Jesus seriously as a preacher of the end, God's restoring of the kingdom at the end of all things. So his moral teaching cannot be extracted into a list of 48 or 800 or 1,000 commands in the way that those websites were doing. His primary concern is to preach the kingdom of God and looking for a response of following him. He's not an ethical teacher with a list of do's and don'ts expecting to be obeyed in that sense. And this method also takes the gospel seriously as ancient biography. And I've pointed to this slide a number of times, where it says, in the first book, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach. That's Luke at the start of the book of Acts. And I like the point he's talking about words and deeds. And when I showed you my analysis of the Gospels, I showed that around about a quarter of each Gospel had the verbs in each Gospel have Jesus as a subject, and a further quarter or so are spoken by Jesus. Half the verbs in the Gospels are spoken by Jesus or done by Jesus. And that is why I came up with the incredibly bleedingly obvious answer that the Gospels are about Jesus, but this was the thing that New Testament scholarship had not realized for about the previous century and so on. And that this approach in particular of looking at words and deeds, because of Jesus' example of the kind of company he kept and how he would talk with one another, and how he included within his group the people who were quite patently not following him, his teaching. I mean, he had a couple of zealots or freedom fighters or terrorists among his disciples. He had a tax collector who was a collaborator with the Romans. I mean, that must have made the disciples' general meetings interesting, to have a couple of guys in the disciples who were sworn to kill one of the other disciples because he was a collaborator with the Romans and a filthy, dirty tax collector. So, I mean, I don't know, TJ, you will have to tell me how your red and blue Braver Angel went, but however difficult it is to get the red and blue to talk to one another, it can't be as bad as trying to get the terrorists or freedom fighters to sit down with a tax collector, collaborator with the Romans, and manage manage to be brothers in the disciples and not kill each other. I also pointed out, and I do like this slide, that one of those commands is very clear. If a legionary asks you to carry his pack, go an extra mile. There is a clear command from Jesus that we are to carry a legionary's pack. And I have pointed out that in all my years backwards and forwards across the bridges across the Thames to our campuses on the other side of the river, where our hospitals and where our war studies department was, I had never met a Roman legionary who asked me to carry his pack. So here's a command of Jesus I have not obeyed, because I have never met a Roman legionary and I haven't been able to carry his pack. So I have a problem, therefore, with an idea that I'm meant to obey Jesus' commands, because I can't do that one. And we also saw that in so many different books of the New Testament are trying to deal with the question of meat offered to idols, which again isn't a problem when I went into Safeways or Giant or Trader Joe's or back on this side of the water, Tesco's. They don't, in the food packaging labeling, along with the calorie content, it doesn't say, warning, this food has been offered to idols. So there is that problem about the fact that the topics in the New Testament are not our topics. And equally, and I used the picture of the Golden Gate Bridge to demonstrate how the difficulty in bridging a very large gulf, a very large gap, that our topics, nuclear war, same-sex issues, abortion, IVF, stem cell research, financial matters, embryo research, euthanasia, assisted dying. If you go to the New Testament and put in the question, what does Jesus have to say about any of those? The answer is nothing. And that is why, and goes back to Amanda's comment about my method, was that to come to the conclusion that you cannot ask 21st century questions of a first century text. And much as I hugely enjoyed my deep relationship with Richard Hayes, who wrote The Moral Vision that I've talked about a number of times, and he was a dear friend, and I'm still in grief and mourning his loss. The whole practical side of his book is to ask 5 major questions of the 21st century, of the first century text, and I just don't think you can do that. And that's why I've said, instead of asking the question, what does it say about abortion, or what does it say about genetic research, let's ask what it says about the value of human life. And suddenly we found we had 200 verses. And instead of asking the question about what does it say about tariffs, to use just a topic chosen at random that might have appeared in the news once or twice, it doesn't say anything about tariffs, but it does have 200 or 300 verses about which are based upon words like gold, silver, purse, belt, rich, poor, and so on. And that these topics of money, sex, power, violence, and the meaning of life, which Matthew thought would be a sexy way of selling my book, and of this course, they are the topics that every human society has generated: laws, ethics, morals, taboos, customs, use whatever word you want. That there is something deep in the human experience of all human cultures down through space and time that feel that these topics need some support. They need some rules, some ethics, some morals put around them. And by and large, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, there's a remarkable convergence, actually, of the sort of feelings that human beings have come to on that. And so this method is an attempt to get over the cultural gap, the fact we're talking with a completely different culture, and the issues of the questions of contingency. But this also enabled me, going back to that list of the thousands of commands of Jesus and so on, the thing that is splitting the churches, and I've just been reading earlier today while I was sitting in hospital, the sort of discussion in one of the Sunday papers about who they think the next Archbishop of Canterbury might be, and it's all about their view to same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage, or prayers with gay couples and so on, as though that was the most important topic in the Bible, and it's not even mentioned. And yet that people are threatening to split the church, and then the Episcopal Church has had a split. The Conservatives went off and founded the Anglican Church of North America, ACNA. Quite why they wanted to name themselves over a pimple on the skin, I really don't know, but there you go, acne, and like to call themselves Anglicans rather than Episcopalians. The split is about sex, and yet actually if you look at the New Testament, as we have done for the last 4 weeks, we discovered that there were 250 verses dealing with the topics of money, 76 about the rich, 50 about poor and poverty, and so on. A huge amount of material in the New Testament about money, and yet we're not talking about it. Equally, there are over 300 verses on war and violence. Again, our response is to put up lots of stained glass windows with all those pictures I showed you when we did that. And although there's nothing about abortion or assisted dying, there were 200 verses about life. But I can only find about 50 verses referring to marriage and divorce. I can find about another 50 verses referring to this word porneia, which is often translated as fornication or harlotry. It means prostitution. It's connected with porn, and fornication, as I pointed out, comes from the Latin the arches, because it was under the arches of the aqueduct in Rome is where you would go if you wanted to find a lady for the night. That comes about 49 times in the New Testament, a large number of which refer to spiritual harlotry, especially 20 references alone in the book of Revelation to Israel or the believers playing the harlot, meaning believing in other gods. And there are no references, 0 references. The word sex or sexuality does not occur. Hetero or homosexuality does not occur in the New Testament. There's a couple of verses which might mean homosexuality, but there's a great debate about what they mean. For instance, the use of the word softies, the adjective to soft, and is that a euphemism or an insult for gays? In the same way that the word gay means happy and light and so on. And if you read most English literature, the word gay is used in that sense. It's only more recently that the word gay has come to mean homosexual. Was the word softy being used in a similar way? We simply don't know. Well, but we do know that Paul uses the word softies, and the English translators translate it as perverts, which whatever softies means, it doesn't mean perverts. And that, frankly, the English translations are just plain wrong to do that. They should translate softies as softies, and then at least we would know what Paul has, the word that Paul is using, if we don't know what he means. So I wanted to suggest that this might suggest that God and Jesus's priorities are very different from those in the church and society today, and that with the best will in the world, the things like money, war, violence, the meaning of life have 2 or 3 times as many verses about them as all the issues we can possibly find to do with sex and marriage and divorce and sexuality. And that's why I then said, well, okay, how do we handle this 200 verses or 300 verses? And I introduced you to this 4-fold method, which I followed from Richard Hayes, who was himself following a trajectory that goes from James Gustafson's famous article in 1970 and been all the way through New Testament scholarship, and has been being refined and being refined. And I think my version of Richard Hayes's version is the most recent and, to me, the most obvious and clearest to understand, because I didn't use all the technical terms that Richard was using, like synthetic and so on. So it's a descriptive task to begin with Jesus' words and deeds, to start with Jesus, not as Richard began, starting with Paul. Start with Jesus. Without Jesus, there is no church. Jesus started the whole thing off. And use the things that we have the triple tradition about, i.e. things that are in Matthew, Mark and Luke, hence triple, and the kind of tools for the historical thing, saying, can we be sure that this is what the historical Jesus of Nazareth, or at least as far as we can tell, this is what the historical Jesus of Nazareth thought. And I think it's pretty incontrovertible that the historical Jesus of Nazareth was not interested in money, that the historical Jesus of Nazareth believed in turning the other cheek and non-violence, that the historical Jesus was passionate about the importance of life and fighting sickness and suffering and death, and that the historical Jesus was not particularly interested in what human beings do with the other human beings with bits of their anatomy. In other words, sex wasn't a very big topic in his topics, and so that gives us a clear start of the things that Jesus thought was important. And then in the second stage, the canonical stage, or the canonical task, is where we do the word exegesis, and I've explained that several times. It's just the Greek word meaning to bring out, to lead out from the text the meaning of the text, to really grapple with it. So instead of having the English word pervert, we look at the Greek text, it's malakos. We look up malakos and how it's used in the rest of Greek literature, and we see it's always used to describe something that's soft. And when it comes in the New Testament, it refers, when Jesus was praising John the Baptist, he said, you didn't go in the desert looking for a man in soft robes. If you want to see soft robes, go and see the softy Herod. John the Baptist, was in rough clothes, eating locusts and wild honey and so on. So that's an example of exegesis. Let's bring out what the word really means. And softies mean softies, it doesn't mean perverts. Rather than eisegesis, which is leading into the text. I'm looking for a text that I can use to attack gays with. Let me use the word softies and translate it as perverts. That is an example of eisegesis, leading and putting our meaning into the text rather than exegesis, bringing it out. And that's where I try to say, how do we grapple with the tensions? How do we look at the best line fit? How does Paul and the rest of the New Testament follow Jesus' teaching and example in his deeds and words, or not? And then the interpretive task was a way of going back to the genre question, distinguishing the 4 subgenres of commands, principles, examples, and so on from one another, so that we can interpret commands as commands and principles as principles. And then only then do we have the practical task of looking into the inclusive community to listen to the voices of people we disagree with, to actually debate it. And that's why, to avoid the situation I felt Richard fell into of if he had lots of texts, privileging one text, or if he had no text, having to use the Old Testament, using the trawler image of dragging a dragnet through the water and picking up everything you possibly could, even though, as you can see in that picture, it meant that you ended up with hundreds of different sorts of fish. And I well remember growing up by a trawler port, which is where about 10 miles down the river from where I now live, where the river meets the sea. The trawlers would bring in the nets and tip them all out on the side of the harbour side, and then we'd have to sort out the mackerel into the mackerel and the haddock into the haddock, and then the ones that they couldn't sell or use they would throw back in, and so on. And so we have to get our dragnet and then sort them out. And it's the sorting out begins with Jesus using the triple tradition and historical tools. And this means being able to take not just what Jesus said, but what Jesus did. Narrative as well as words, examples as well as stories. And that, I suggested, was the idea of using the mathematical concept of a scattergram or a best line fit, like trying to discern the Milky Way in the night sky, where we can see the stars are all closely together, and you can see this white line, this Milky Way, going through the sky, which is the axis of the galaxy. And looking, where is the Milky Way in Jesus's teaching? Where is the general direction? Where is the overall trend he's going in? And what I discovered writing this was that there is a contrast between Jesus' words and Jesus' deeds. His words, his preaching and teaching, are very, very hard line, more conservative than most ultra-conservatives. Give all your possessions and sell your possessions and give everything away. Take no thought for tomorrow. Don't have any insurances. Don't have any mortgages. Don't have a house. Don't know where to put anywhere to lay your head. Turn the other cheek. Carry the legionary's pack. Don't reply with violence. This is incredibly impossible teachings. Very, very hard line. Very demanding, and particularly on money and violence and on marriage. And clearly, his ethical teaching was a significant challenge to the contemporary morality of his own day, and I would suggest even more so to ours. And yet, it's set within this biographical narrative, and that is the bit that the looking at all the commands and looking at all the teaching misses, because he lived out his teaching as a single ascetic person who loved going to parties. And when the wine ran out, he produced gallons and gallons and gallons of a very fine vintage out of the water pots. He was accused by the religious leaders of being a drunkard and a friend of sinners. And, one of the Pharisees, when he invited him to dinner and a sinful woman anointed his feet, thought, well, this guy's not much good as an archbishop. He doesn't realize how he is being made impure by this sinful woman lavishing love and care on him. And Jesus had to teach Simon the fact that the person who's been forgiven a great debt is very grateful. And Simon may have been a good man. Jesus doesn't criticize Simon. He just says, you've not committed a lot of sins, and therefore there hasn't been a huge amount for God to forgive, and you're not very grateful. She may well be a sinner, but she's been forgiven a huge amount, and she's being very grateful. And I'm perfectly happy, thank you very much, that she's given me some nice smelling oil and washed my feet, because you didn't do that for me when I came in. Fighting talk, really. And so there is this contrast of how does Jesus go around doing his hard teaching in the context of an inclusive, open, pastoral habit of the company that he kept. And then the question is, how has the church followed Jesus and the New Testament? So here are our 4 topics. We're going to now, if you thought I was going fast before, fasten your seatbelts. We're going to do all 4 topics in the next 5 minutes. For using the fourfold method, when we looked at war and violence, we discovered that Jesus' preaching of the kingdom of God, or the rule of God, the reign of God, sounded like a direct challenge to the state, because the word kingdom that is used there, the word basileia in Greek, malkut in Hebrew, was the word that meant not just the kingdom of Herod or people like that, or the kingdom of Judea, but the kingdom of Caesar. It's the same, we would call it empire. but it's the same word. And so you should think about Jesus is talking about the empire of God. And he's suggesting the empire of God is a very different empire from the empire of Caesar, or from that matter, the empire of Putin or Trump or any other dictator or emperor or whatever. And his clear teaching about non-violence and non-resistance challenges the tendency of all kingdoms and empires to base their security on militarism, armies, and so on. And he lived out that teaching in his own suffering and his own non-resistance at his arrest, leading even to his death. And we see how the rest of the New Testament, Luke shows the church trying to handle that in Acts. The Gospels reflect Jesus' teaching, and this is made explicit in Paul and his own suffering in the rest of the New Testament, through to the theme of martyrdom in the book of Revelation. And it's there in all of the subgenres, with the commands to non-violence, turn the other cheek, do not repay violence with violence, the clear principles of self-denial and taking up the cross, the examples to follow of Jesus and Paul, Stephen the first martyr, and the overall biblical worldview of God entering into our human world and accepting human violence and the power of the state, and letting it do its worst to him, and still rising above it and saying, war and violence does not have the last word. Death, where is your sting? But ever since Constantine received that vision in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, conquer, the idea that you should go conquering with an army in the sign of the cross, the church has struggled to apply this to how to run governments. It used non-Christian Greek-Roman moral philosophy to develop the whole idea of just war theory. There is no suggestion whatsoever in the New Testament that war can ever be just. And the development of the Augustinian idea of the city of God and the city of Babylon, and Luther's idea of the two kingdoms, which meant that the German confessing church did not have any means to resist Hitler, nor did the Dutch Reformed Church have any means to resist apartheid. And so that is a good example of an absolute clear direction of travel from Jesus right through the New Testament, which the church basically since the 3rd century has not followed. Same is true of money. The clear direction of travel from Jesus' led teachings of a lack of concern for money. He's constantly telling people to give your money away, give your wealth away. The way he lives as a wandering ascetic with no possessions, renouncing it all. And yet, the story is that he includes tax collectors in his group, and he has wealthy women who are actually funding the mission. And we see how Matthew tries to handle that in the daily life, but retains the emphasis, but he does tend to spiritualize it. Blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, whereas Luke says, blessed are those who are just plain hungry and thirsty. Paul's warning about wealth and his constant concern for the collection for the poor church in Jerusalem, the rest of the New Testament, and yet the evidence not only of early communist or communal, depending on how you want to translate the word koinonia, communion, communal experiments in shared living in Acts, but also the use of richer houses in Acts where churches met and so on. And it's there in the 4 subgenres, the commands to sell everything, the principle about not trusting in wealth, Jesus and Paul's example, and the overall biblical worldview. The same message in all the genres. And yet, equally, since the 3rd century, the church has struggled to apply this to real life. And that's why they invented monks and nuns and religious communities where they take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Because only if you do take those vows can you actually do what Jesus said. The rest of us live in the real world. At least the church for about 1400 years refused to allow interest, put their money out to usury. Whereas, of course, as we saw with the debt clock running, the whole of the world economic system runs upon the idea of interest and usury these days. Exactly what Jesus says you shouldn't do. And so there's still an enormous challenge to the world today in that area. In terms of sexuality, Jesus affirmed when he was asked to adjudicate between the conservatives and the liberals, he went for even stronger than the conservatives. He said, one flesh, one man, one woman, 4 keeps, permanent, lifelong, heterosexual, exclusive relationship, stronger than even the leader of the conservatives. No exceptions, no divorce, no allowance whatsoever. Total opposition to porneia, whatever that means, and I'm arguing it's got something to do with prostitution and with sex for money. And then he lives that out in his own ascetic single lifestyle, but he hangs around with prostitutes, who he says we should avoid porneia, and sexual sinners in his group. So it's the same thing. They're very hard teaching, but with his open and inclusive acceptance. And we see the difficulties that Matthew and Paul have in trying to apply Jesus' very, very, very hardline ideal teaching to the practical issues of sex and marriage in their congregations. And we saw also Luke's particular sympathy to women, the clear antagonism to porneia right across the New Testament, and that homosexuality, if it occurs at all, is a very minor issue with one or two occurrences in the so-called vice lists. In terms of the four genera, there are the commands against porneia: shun porneia, flee porneia, keep your way away from porneia. The principle of one flesh and faithfulness and love and loyalty. We see the examples of Jesus and Paul, and the overall biblical worldview of creation, fall, incarnation, and redemption. And looking at the history of the church, have they followed Jesus? Well, the traditional negativity to sexuality, the elevation of celibacy in an attempt to follow Jesus, has not gone well, as we know from all the sex scandals in all the major churches. The inconsistency of the treatment of women who were clearly ministers within Jesus' own community and within the first couple of centuries. The different approaches to how we handle divorce today that Jesus banned, which is perfectly accepted in all the churches today, and yet homosexuality that he didn't say anything about, people have got problems about, and all the development of gender issues. So again, a real problem in following there. And in terms of life, we saw that here was a very clear direction of travel, that life is to be lived in the light of the kingdom and eternal life. And important though human life is, it must be sacrificed for the sake of eternal life. But Jesus' real anger and passion at sin and suffering and death and disease, particularly when it affected children, and his desire to heal and to liberate. Think of the widow of Nain, whose son he raised, or Lazarus, and so on. And yet the one life he wasn't bothered about was his own, and accepted his own suffering and death, and the way in which he follows that through from the Old Testament. And we saw how Luke amplifies particularly the concern for children, the very fuller meaning of the word life, which is one of John's favourite words, Paul's understanding of what it means to be human, his anthropology on living in Christ. For me to live is Christ, but to die, to give up my life, is gain. And Paul saying, I don't know which is better, to stay. I would like to die and go and be with the Lord, but I'm going to stay alive because I'm still trying to serve you. And how the rest of the New Testament sees God as the author of life and being faithful even unto death in the book of Revelation. And in the four subgenres, there are very few direct commands, and the ones that there are we don't keep, like cut off your arm or your foot if it's stopping you entering into kingdom, or pluck out your eyes if it causes you to sin. And most churches have very few one-eyed, one-handed people, and if they are, this is a result of accident. It's not because they've done it to themselves. The principles about God as the source of life, the body as the temple of the Spirit, the concern for the least of my brethren, the examples of John the Baptist and Jesus in the womb, the overall theology in favour of life, and this great tradition of the care for the suffering, hospitals, relief of needs, go back to my having been in hospital all night, and the curious modern singling out, when we've got this huge, wonderful tradition of caring for life and health and healing, of turning it into trying in the so-called pro-life lobby, bombing and shooting doctors that are trying to help pregnant women in through abortion clinics, or stopping stem cell research, or what are the resistance to assisted dying for people who are terminally ill and suffering huge pain and so on. Whereas we should be looking at the wider life of the Christian desire for life and the relief of suffering. And so in this practical stage, which is where I hand it over to you, which is why I'm coming to the end, it is in that group that you can then consider all that ethical material, all those hundreds of verses, all those squirming, wriggling fish that I am dumping on your harbour side, and looking at it within an inclusive community, which includes those with whom you disagree, and you listen to the voices of those who are most affected. Do not be surprised that a bunch of white Afrikaners interpreted the New Testament to benefit white Afrikaners. Do not be surprised that elderly white male bishops thought you had to be elderly white male in order to be a bishop. You have to have the voices of those who are being excluded included in the conversation, and then you will read the text differently. And by and large, we have to say that the church has not really followed the clear biblical ethic from Jesus and the New Testament. And that's why I take my inspiration from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of a mixed and inclusive community, discussing these issues around the table, where the voices of the so-called outside voices, the poor, the women, LGBTQI, the developing world, the childless couples, those with terminal illnesses and so on, need to be heard. And we need to build a community that listens to their voices and to follow Jesus' habit. Are we prepared to be accused of being friends of sinners? Or are we trying to be so ethically pure we become judgmental excluders? So in the answer to the question, can we actually follow Jesus today? Has the church followed Jesus' direction? We had the method in week 1. We discovered in week 2 in War and Violence, the answer is quite clearly no, the church has not followed Jesus. In week 3, we discovered, yes, the church has followed Jesus' concern for life, health and healing, but it's now got itself into a terrible tangle over the so-called pro-life lobby issuing death threats at abortion clinics. We discovered again on the money questions, no, the church has not followed. On the sex questions, I have to say that the church's negative reaction to sexuality has not really followed that. And and what about me? I'm a priest whose marriage broke down. I'm a divorced priest, so that's not a very good start. Yes, I've had a mortgage, and I have a roof over my head, and I'm very grateful for that. And yet Jesus says I shouldn't do that, and I shouldn't have a bank account, and I shouldn't have anywhere to lay my head. So that's sex and money. In terms of war and violence, I can get quite angry, but whether I like it or not, I pay my taxes, and a large part of my taxes goes to fund destructive weapons of mass destruction and sending our troops in to go around killing people and so on. So actually, I'm not very good at following Jesus. None of us are. And so I conclude with this recognition of the overall coherence of Jesus' ethical teaching and example. And we have to be honest about how little of it all the church has accepted to put into practice, how little of it all I find I can follow and put into practice. This isn't me criticizing everybody else. I fail. And I don't understand why a couple of minor issues like abortion and homosexuality become the acid test of so-called being biblically orthodox, such that people are prepared to split the church over them or to use violence against medics in clinics, when the larger, clear areas such as the use of non-violence and money are not being followed. And I've asked this question of whether this fourfold method that I provided you with gives you a way to work with lots of material for you to discuss in your groups that I'm handing over to you now. That the New Testament is not a book of ethics. Jesus is not a moral teacher, but it has given us hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of verses. I'm not prepared to say that the New Testament has nothing to say to our moral and ethical dilemmas today. I think I've demonstrated it has hundreds of things to say. But you have to get together in inclusive communities to take it forward. And so I leave you with the challenge of how does Christchurch Winnetka take it forward, and the reminder that please don't let Gary have to take any of the books away. Please try and clean up the last few copies. And thank you all very much. And we've got a little bit of time if you have for further questions and comments that anybody would like to make. And TJ, I think I've turned off the share, so you should now be hearing me in the room.
Yes, we can still hear you.
And it means also probably if those online want to make any comments, we can get them up on the telly.
Yeah. Do we have any questions?
Or comments or answers to my question about how you'd like to take this forward.
Discussion.
So I think TJ, I'm not hearing the comment being made in the room, and I can see that David is waving a hand online. But let's go with the comment in the room first.
Gary?
TJ, I'm just wondering, will we follow up with this in the fall in formation classes or formation sessions starting in September? I don't know.
That is a question you've got to ask your rector and your clergy. It's not for me to answer that question. I've done what they've asked me to do, and over to you now. But I'll leave you to ask them that.
No, my question was to TJ.
So I'll respond to that briefly. We are going to be doing another series with the Braver Angels group that had come previously. So we're going to be kicking off the September series with Braver Angels coming for several Sundays in that. I've also heard interest in potentially doing a book study on some of Richard's work. And as just mentioning that, there's several heads nodding around the room, so I don't see any reason why we couldn't explore that at some point too. So I think we absolutely could and should.
And TJ, if I could just say to that, I mean, I'm really, really pleased. I'm so grateful for that fortnight I spent up in Winnetka, especially the lessons in humility that your rector dealt me on the golf course. I really loved joining in your worship, and I've enjoyed these classes very much. And should you wish to do some further study of one of my books, I'm perfectly open to the idea of Matthew coming back to me and seeing whether we couldn't again have me zooming in. And I've also suggested that if the good Bishop Paula, I think, the Bishop of Chicago, would like me to come and do a training session conference for her clergy and fly me over anytime, I would willingly do that.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so David had a question online.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. This is a really unformed thought, but I can see parallels between Richard's idea of inclusive communities discussing these issues and the fairly well-known idea of stakeholder workshops, getting together all stakeholders in a particular problem or issue for dialogue. And there's a related idea of citizen assemblies within a community. And here in Exeter, the university has a Global Systems Institute, which is working with the people of the city in an attempt to institutionalize citizens' assemblies. And I can see the parallels, and it would be really interesting to see how we can look at these three models of dialogue and collective decision-making and collective interpretation, and see if we can produce some kind of constructive synthesis.
Yeah. And of course, at the heart of all democracy is the idea of checks and balances on power between the head of state, the legislative, the executive, the police, and so on. And in any society where one of those is trying to dictate to the rest of the society, down that route lies dictatorships and all the horrors that we saw under Hitler and so on. And if you think I'm referring to anybody in particular, all I can say is it says in Mark chapter 13, let the reader understand. I couldn't possibly comment. Actually, in my mind, I have somebody in England particularly in mind that I was thinking of, but you may have others. And just to prove that the widest gaps can be bridged, of course, David coming in from Exeter reminds me that Richard Clement is bringing that wonderful Christchurch choir to sing a whole week here in Exeter Cathedral the first week in August. So we will, as well as having had Exeter in Winnetka, we will have Winnetka in Exeter.
To be continued, definitely. Well,
Thank you.
and thank you so much for leading this series and for all the hard work and energy and thought that you put into it, especially as you're recovering, and we hope that you feel better soon. Thank you so much for.
Thank you. Well, thank you one and all. It's been an honor and a privilege, and I've really enjoyed it.